Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin O'Connor, and I'm Director here at NLA. Delighted to welcome you to this NLA Breakfast Talk, looking at how the shift to home working has impacted on our net zero ambition. Our speakers today will reflect on what this meant for carbon emissions and air pollution, and what can be done to make sure employers and employees are supported in taking sustainable actions. I'd like to thank the City of London Corporation, City Air, Cheapside Business Alliance and Nomura, who have been central in promoting awareness on this topic and have worked with NLA in putting together today's event. Together, we've also created a document with some tips for everyone who is working from home on how to reduce their carbon emissions, and you can find this on the NLA website. I'd also like to thank our net zero programme champions, Elementa, Hain Tillett Steel, Hawley, London and Partners, Miele and Waterman. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end. So please do post your questions using the Zoom Q&A button throughout the event. I'd now like to invite Claire de Montier-Marriage, who's the bid manager at Cheapside Business Alliance, to say a few words. Claire.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be kicking off today's discussion. As we sit in our homes this morning, there's no long commute. Many of us haven't done this for nearly a year now. There's no sitting in large air-conditioned buildings. You might be forgiven or think that we're in a lockdown or a bit of climate change. However, in reality, it's not that straightforward. It's important what we consider a true impact of home working and on air pollution emissions, giving us something here to stay long after lockdown. There's around 15 million people working from home since corona restrictions. So companies have been supporting their employees slightly at home because of workplaces changed and things have shifted much more towards global oil production. But these emissions haven't disappeared. They've just been created somewhere else. Now, this is something that the CBA very much talked about in their steering group late last year on how we could support our community, business community, on how we could engage and support businesses through these turbulent times. So as we focus in this crisis, we're also assessing the impacts of new working places and environments to support this system. Through our environmental steering group, we've been working together, and we'd like to bring this event, thanks to we brought this event together today. Though during lockdown, overall electricity consumption has plunged by 20% or more, utilities have increased through residential demand. Home working is here to stay, but then we're also going to return back to the office. But this will result in an increase in emissions and restrictions ease. We therefore need to be acting now to make sensible choices about how we manage our emissions in the future. I'm really looking forward to today on these interesting discussions this morning, and thank you all in advance for your contributions to this input debate. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm now delighted to introduce Keith Bottomley, who's Vice Chairman of Policy and Chairman of the Port Health and Environment Committee for the City of London Corporation. Keith.
Thanks very much, Ben. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this event today to consider the impact of home working on two topics of great importance to me: air quality and climate change. Now, these two issues, of course, are inextricably linked and are both very high priorities for us at the City of London Corporation. In October of last year, we published our climate action strategy that sets out how we will achieve net zero, build climate resilience and champion sustainable growth. And we've made three very important commitments: to achieve net zero carbon emissions on our own operations in 6 years' time by 2027, to achieve net zero carbon emissions across our investments and supply chain, that's the really hard bit, by 2040, and to support the achievement of net zero for the square mile also by 2040. We've been sourcing around 100% of renewable electricity for our buildings and operations since 2018. And in November of last year, we signed a really exciting 15-year power purchase agreement to buy all of the electricity produced by a newly built 95,000 panel solar farm in Dorset. Our transport strategy, interestingly, includes a range of proposals to reduce the amount of motorised traffic on the city streets and to encourage cleaner vehicles. And just last month, we approved the first of our last mile logistics hubs to consolidate deliveries across central London. This scheme will turn 39 car parking spaces in London Wall into a hub for Amazon logistics. And the final leg of the parcel deliveries will be undertaken by e-cargo bikes and people on foot, you know, the good old traditional ways that things used to happen, removing 85 vehicles from the city's roads each day. So that's very exciting, and we're going to be having more of those last mile logistics hubs in the city over the next few years. We continue to work with our partners, of course, very importantly, to deliver sustained air quality improvements and to trial innovative technologies and develop and encourage best practice and push for the regulatory powers that are required to secure better air quality over the long term, particularly through our emissions reduction local authorities in London private members bill, which we have before Parliament at the moment. We work very closely, of course, with city businesses, many of whom will be at this event today. And we recognise all that great work to improve the local environment through our annual Clean City Awards. We're far from complacent, however, and it's through working together at events like this and sharing ideas that we'll be able to deliver a better environment for everyone that lives in and works in and also visits the Square Mile. Of course, today we're here to discuss the impact of home working on emissions of both air pollutants and greenhouse gases. Over 90% of employees commute into the city by public transport every day, as we know, so there's very little emission saving from that sector. Instead, of course, we need to consider the energy used to heat individual homes, particularly at this time of year when it's cold, and balance that against energy used to heat an office that may accommodate hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So how do we account for that heat energy? How do we account for the electricity used by employees at home, especially as we're pushing developers to install renewable forms of energy in city buildings? Do we need to consider our home working policies to ensure that they cut emissions and not increase them? Many organisations like ourselves are beginning to ask these very important questions, and having been forced to embrace home working on a large scale this year, this has become even more important. We are very keen to share ideas and best practice, and I look forward very much to this morning's discussion, which I hope will help us all to develop solutions to important questions like these.
Thank you very much, Keith. So our first presentation today, we're going to hear from Sarah Mukherjee, who's the CEO of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, and she'll be giving us a presentation about what businesses can do to reduce their carbon emissions. Sarah.
Oh, it's nearly on mute there, nearly £10 in the charity box. Thanks very much indeed, Ben, and thank you to all our previous speakers. Hello, yes, and a very good morning. It's funny, isn't it? Even though we're all sitting at home, my husband this morning said, oh, it's Friday, it's the weekend coming up. So there is still some sense of the working patterns, even though they're all beginning to blur a little bit. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with some personal reflections, then just talk a little bit about scope 1, 2 and 3, because I know a lot of people on this call will be cognizant of this, but just think about how we might be thinking about that differently in the future. Doing the right thing as employers and what managers require for this new future. And it's going to be a mixture of stuff we're talking about in IEMA, but also stuff that I'm thinking about as an SME leader outside London, and we'll get to that now in a minute. Next slide, please. So you may be wondering who this woman in a stripy shirt is who's talking to you. IEMA is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. We are a professional body for anybody who has an interest. We say to make a difference to the world we share. Obviously, that's usually environment and sustainability professionals, but we welcome everybody from all aspects of business. If you have an interest in sustainability, then come along and see what we have to offer you. Keith, maybe we should have a conversation. We've got lots of members all over the world, and so we'd like to think of ourselves as a family where you can find out everything you want to know through best practice and peer-to-peer learning as well. And we do quite a lot in the policy space at national and international levels. Next slide, please. So why has she got a very dull building? On the next slide, you're thinking, this is our office, and this is our office that's up for lease, like loads and loads and loads of other offices up and down the country. Now, I do have to admit, here that, as you can see, we are not London based, but like many SMEs, we kind of landed where we fell. I think where the first guy, because it normally was a guy in those days, had the idea of the organisation, and that's where we started. But we spent an awful lot of time putting people on the train down to London. In fact, I joined in lockdown on the 1st of June, leading this organisation, and my working model was going to be working from home once a week, being in the office once a week, and being in London 3 days a week, usually in Westminster or Whitehall for political or policy meetings. And that's all been completely blown out of the water. I think if I said to the board when I arrived, well, I'm going to sit in my kitchen for 5 days a week and just talk to everybody there, they go, okay, you're fired. But here we all are. I think, like many managers, we've put it up. We're cursing the fact we missed our last break clause, and we're locked into a contract for several years. And we're all eagerly looking at the bottom line and the savings we could make by not having the office at all. As our previous speakers have said, the bums on seats model has been completely trashed. I think if we were all back within 2 or 3 months, we might have said, okay, that's a horrible dream. You're all back and sitting where you should be now. But I have appointed half the senior team, and none of them live anywhere near Lincolnshire. Now, this is going to cut 2 ways. I think not only is it going to be good for company, I have to say, please don't shoot the messenger, but we are all now looking at a London pool, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, a diverse, highly talented pool of people who would normally be working in London. And we can say, well, look, you can work from home, meet up maybe once a month when we finally can get to meet up, and we'll pay you the same salary, so you can come and work for us instead. So in terms of expanding our potential pool of talent, it's been great. But of course, it does mean that we're going to have to pay, the same sort of wages that companies in London were as well. So, there's going to be a lot of swings and roundabouts on there. I mean, we're all feeling our way as leaders in this new reality, and there's going to be quite a lot of time for reflection. There will have to be, and how we manage the new future. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about scope 1, 2, and 3. If you are a responsible business, and there are hundreds and thousands of responsible businesses on this call, there are obviously, you want to look at how you can drive down your carbon emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions are categorized into 3 groups or scope by the most widely used international accounting tool. That's something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Scope 1 is fairly obvious. It's all the direct stuff. Scope 2 is the heat, electricity that you might be purchasing, and steam, obviously, if you're in manufacturing. Scope 3 is where a lot of organizations feel they can really drive down the benefits, because it's up and down the supply chain, it's employee commuting, as we were talking about. But increasingly, I'm going to suggest that we're going to have to look at working from home for all the reasons that the previous speakers have spoken about. Business travel, woohoo, we haven't gone anywhere or done anything. Well, we've done loads, but we haven't been anywhere to do it in the last year. That's been fantastic for our own business accounting, because we hold ourselves to very strict targets. As you can imagine, we're trying to reduce 43% of our greenhouse gas emissions within the next 5 years as an organisation. No business travel, but 30 people all working separately, using separate heat and light, and using separate internet. None of this is free from a carbon point of view. And so we're going to have to think, I think, very closely about what that means, not only for our own carbon accounting, but also for the relationship that we have with our staff teams. This idea where you can be a bit semi-detached. Well, look, here's a job. Live where you like. That's nothing to do with us. If you want to travel, 400 miles round trip and sit on a train for 4 hours, that's fine. But that's up to you, not us. Apart from the fact that we don't use the car, we'll disincentivize that, because obviously that's big on carbon emissions. I think there may have to be a much more interventionist style from organizations that care about carbon. Next slide, please. So we've had a few thoughts which we've put together in our Build Back Better document, and there's a suite of measures we think obviously would really help if we are going to reduce our carbon emissions in the right way and come back from this pandemic in a much greener and leaner way in terms of reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Green finance, obviously, that's a bit of a no-brainer. But when we say active planning for a circular economy, that also means stopping people getting in their cars and even on trains in order to go to work. I mean, a model where it looks a bit mad now, doesn't it? I mean, I think that the office, as we know it, is going to go the way of the typewriter. Because this idea that everybody has to pile into a place, bricks and mortar in order to do a job and then go home again is obviously not necessary. It needs, I think, some organisations to get out of a bit of a 1950s mindset that, you're not working unless I can see you doing it. There has to be a much more trust and much more thought from senior leadership about how you manage teams and bring them together. But there is no reason why a team that you have, who happens to live in Kent, for example, discovered that about 15% of our workforce live in Kent. Who knew? Because I didn't ask them when I employed them. Maybe they could have a hub of their own, a local hub where they can meet and they can exchange information and have that creative thing, but they don't actually have to come to London or Lincoln or anywhere really, particularly as we have members, as I said, in 115 countries. The opportunity, therefore, to also develop maybe some competitive carbon reduction through different geographically spread teams, I think, is much greater. But that requires thought and process and time and space to do that from senior leadership teams. So you'll have to really shift resource from driving down one bit of your carbon emissions to driving down another. Next slide, please. And I think this, as I said, could bring a huge number of benefits in terms of how we are really beginning to get at that intractable problem of greenhouse gas emissions from domestic heating and lighting. We've all been kind of riding the wave a bit. I mean, we as an organisation give people a premium during the winter. We've started doing that since everybody's working from home to reflect. I mean, it's not a lot of money, and some of it is taxable, but just to reflect the fact that people are using their own gas, energy, heating and lighting whilst they're at home and still working for us, and obviously they're paying for their own Wi-Fi as well. So maybe we'll get to a future where your company does that. That's part of your benefit. If you want to attract the best workers who have, and the idea of having dynamic, engaged people, they often come with a set of values which includes, I'm very glad to say, saving the planet. Maybe as an organisation you will use the power of collective purchasing or large purchasing to support insulation in people's homes. Maybe you'll be offering green tariffs as well, again with the collective purchasing power that large organisations will be able to bring to the table. That's something else that companies may have to think about in order to attract the best talent. As I said, really, the world is your job marketplace now if you are bright, motivated, and the sort of person that you would want in your organisation. We are going to have to think about collective working. I think we've all agreed that, and that's what previous speakers have said. There will be a need for that human contact and interaction, but being able to do that in a way that's going to have to be more facilitated, because let's be honest, I mean, I think it's going to be at least a year before we're anything back to like normal. I have a friend of mine who's a public health expert at Cambridge, and their thoughts were probably 2022 before it starts to look like normal, i.e. we all pile in and cough at each other inside a room somewhere, and so devoting resource to how that works, how you make sure that that collective organizational creative spark stays alive when people might be working in very different offices, booking time in once or twice a week to be at places. There'll have to be a serious amount of coordination, which we are already thinking about, and I'm devoting half a person just to think about how we do that and make sure that we are all traveling in the same journey. Communication, internal communication is going to be absolutely crucial to this journey. And for organisations outside London, diversity. We are environment and sustainability organisations, ironically, are terribly badly diverse. And I speak as a person of colour leading an organisation. I am almost unique. 4% of the workforce is from Black, Asian or minority ethnic background, and that is a disgrace, frankly, and has to change. And so there'll be organisations like me looking at the pool of a diverse workforce in urban areas and thinking, right, that's exactly where we need to be looking. So hopefully the diversity love will be spread around more organisations, but that means that, you know, we will be competing for the best and most brilliant graduates and school leavers of colour and of all other different cultural backgrounds and heritage. It's not, obviously, it's not just about cultural background, but every single area in diversity. Next slide, please. So a couple more minutes left, so I'll be brief. So as I said, it's going to be, I think, you know, and I'm drawing the positives. You know, we're all, frankly, you know, I've had 2 or 3 members of staff, members of our staff team break down in tears when I've said, "How are you?" On my regular one-to-ones with them. It is really, really tough. People are feeling it, particularly if you have childcare responsibilities, if you're on sharing rented accommodation with 4 or 5 people who, you know, with the best will in the world, you didn't expect you were going to be living with forever, or if you're on your own, or if you have elderly relatives to care with, or people who are shielded. We've all got people in our organisations who are like that. And I think the idea that you leave your feelings and thoughts at the office door is no longer an option. You have to, as a leader, be involved in the emotional and well-being aspects of your team, which I think is a good thing, as much as they wish to share that with you. I mean, obviously, you know, there's a line, an intrusive line you don't want to cross, but this getting rid of this 50s mindset, you know, we're all here just to make money and that's it, is, I think, a very welcome thing. We have to support and help each other along this journey because we're all learning. And I think this idea of work-life balance where, you know, the emails are being, I mean, I've had to stop members of our team answering emails at 8 in the evening or working at 9 in the evening because it's not healthy and we all need time off. And I think if we can get some of that balance and some of that collaborative thinking and genuine leadership and partnership, along with a reduction in climate damaging greenhouse gases, I think that can only be a good thing for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There's a lot to unpick there, but I'm sure a lot that we can all relate to. For those of you who joined while Sarah was speaking, please do remember you can ask questions throughout and we will get to those at the end of the event. So we're doing things a little bit differently today. I'm going to invite our panel to feedback now, but each of our panelists does have a short presentation as well. So we're going to start with James Ross, who's the CSR executive for Buzzercot. James, can you tell us about the actions you are taking to reduce Scope 3 emissions and what are you doing to support staff working from home? You there, James?
Hi there. Hi, Ben. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. So this is a very timely moment, I think, for many organisations who are starting to consider exactly what home working looks like in the longer term. I think many people maybe thought that this was a short-term thing, and I think we were all very clear that that's not the case now. So this is quite reflective on what we're doing, and also this is a point in our journey where we were already looking at our sustainability and exactly how we're going to engage in that in more detail, but now is the time for us to do that with a very different perspective. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the background about our organisation, then look at some of the challenges and opportunities that are presented by this new way of working that we're all experiencing, and then also then look at some of our future plans and the way that we're starting to think about what we want to do. And while we may not have exactly come to our conclusions yet, and I don't think everybody has, I think it's very important that we're all starting to engage in this discussion and learn from one another. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So first and foremost, looking at the background, Buzzercot, who are we? We're a firm of around 450 people, predominantly chartered accountants, and we're based in an office that's near St Paul's. We occupy 4 of the 6 floors in that office, and as was previously mentioned, we don't really have people coming to drive. There's no on-site parking, so we're one of those offices where people will be coming in by public transport. I think that's quite useful background to sort of demonstrate exactly where we sit within the city, and particularly the fact that we occupy 4 of the 6 floors. That demonstrates we rent part of a building and we are not necessarily owners, and that has some implications in the way that we're able to think about that, and particularly sustainability moving forward. So if we look at our office culture, we've been really positive in our ability to have recycling initiatives in the firm and actually get some engagement from multiple people within the organisation and sort of promoting that kind of initiative into the home environment as well. And I think that's sort of a mentality that we've always sort of had. We've quite wanted to ensure that anything that we're doing in the office is reflected across all team members and that they're able to take that home in the first place. We've engaged in quite a lot of environmental volunteering. Thames 21 is an organisation we've volunteered with multiple times in the past. And so I suppose we already had a culture of considering environmental sustainability in our sort of working practices, but the challenge there comes to taking that actually into the home environment. So looking at scope 3, tracking employee travel is something that we've started to do in a more detailed way. Previously, we were recording the travel and making a judgment on making a judgment on the carbon emissions that are associated with that, but we're being a lot more clear in the way that we do that by recording the exact number of miles. And while that might seem very obvious, it was something that we hadn't necessarily considered as being a significant change in the way that we reported. Working with our suppliers has been really important, and whenever we're working with suppliers, we want to ensure that our value chain is as green as it can possibly be. And also engaging with our employees is a really important part of that. And I think Sarah mentioned that sort of the way that we communicate with one another about this is going to have a really significant impact in how we move forward. So looking at our initial COVID response, take me back a year, and we didn't really quite know where we were going to be. And when it really struck and we started to work from home, I think I'm fair to admit, and I think many other organisations probably felt the same, that it was somewhat of a survival mode response. We weren't sure where this was going to take us. And one of the most important and significant factors for us is ensuring that actually everyone that works for us still had a job to come back to. That took some time for us to sort of establish exactly what it was looking like. There were furlough schemes coming around. Is that relevant to us? How do we sort of respond to that? But once we'd sort of got our eggs in a row, the things that we started to look at were less to do with our sustainability in the first instance. And my role as a CSR executive covers a broad range of different initiatives. What I really looked at is philanthropy and our local community. We're talking about the City of London here, and many of us work there. And the community that exists within the city and the surrounding boroughs is very important to us. So we were looking at how we could support organisations that maintained some of our key objectives around supporting children and social mobility. Volunteering, we suddenly had a community that spread out to where everybody lives, not just that local to us. And so we really wanted to encourage people to volunteer in a safe and sort of sensible way to support those in the local community. And then mental health and wellbeing also became a challenge, which Sarah really importantly touched on. It's not just about how we work from home, but how we work from home effectively and positively. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So challenges, I mentioned our office building. When it's open, it's open. That sounds like quite an obvious statement, but the reality is that our building doesn't have independent units for every single floor. So when it's open, actually, it's a fully functional building. The heating goes on and the building is heated. So that meant that actually our facilities costs didn't really reduce in a way that we were expecting. We'd forecasted for reductions, and then looking back across that, it wasn't necessarily the case. So it's really important for us to work with the other landlords and other tenants in that building to sort of understand exactly what it is that we might want to do if the office is completely closed. But the reality is some people do need to go in sometimes. Then looking at our reporting, it's really important for us to report transparently, and that becomes a significant challenge for us in terms of making sure that we can actually account for every single individual, the number of hours that they're working, and the differences of that home environment. Using residential energy, that's obviously increased, as Claire mentioned at the start. So it's quite hard for us to equate for exactly what that looks like compared to what our office usage looks like. The reality, as I mentioned, is that actually our facilities costs have not dramatically decreased in the building that we are renting. So there's a double problem here. And actually we're accounting for people being at home and an office that is also running. And then challenges with working with team members. And while we would like to believe that absolutely everyone is fully on board with this, I'm sure anyone that sort of works in corporate responsibility or looks at sustainability within their organization, when you're starting to bring other team members and make it their responsibility in some way to take action, while people often have good intentions, the behaviors that associate with that are not always going to have the outcomes that you'd like. So it's about trying to encourage everybody to make those changes independently. And I think it was mentioned before about how we might want to introduce policy to do this. That also becomes quite a contentious issue if you're telling people what they should be doing in their own homes. And so that's a really difficult consideration for organizations like ours to make a really positive impact with that. Making small and practical change, meaningful and practical changes is something that's going to be quite interesting as well, because it's, I think when you talk about things like reducing the amount of water you put in your kettle, I think it's quite hard for an individual to necessarily say, oh, well, I've made a huge difference by doing that. But what we need to start communicating is how that on a larger scale with maybe 400 kettles going off actually makes a very big impact. And then we also need to consider our larger scale options, which is quite a tricky thing in terms of looking at what the home office environment looks like. We really want to incentivize people, we really want people to participate. And I think waste management is one thing that is really interesting. In the city, it's fantastic. We have a waste service provider, they come in, they do their thing. We can control what the office bins look like and how our waste is managed. Actually, every single council operates differently. I don't have any recycling collection from my house, so I have to actually take it myself to a local recycling point. And so actually the challenges associated with waste management and Scope 3 is going to be something that quite how we start recording and reporting on that is very much up for discussion. So if we can go to the next slide. So opportunities. This is a reality, so we have to embrace the new ways of working. We've already done an internal survey to understand exactly what people are thinking about what they want to do in the future. There's absolutely a desire that people want to work from home more, but the reality is some people do want to come to the office. They love being in that environment and they enjoy working with their team members. So how do we find a fair balance in that? Pressing the refresh button. Sustainability, while the main objectives remain the same, we do have to start considering that in a very different way. And a lot of that is going to be how we actually record and report all of that information. Working with others to define best practice, this is a great example of that. This is the perfect opportunity now, while we're faced with new challenges, to actually engage in best practice meetings and start working out what works for us as individuals might be very different from another organization that operates differently. But what can we learn from that? And a great opportunity to start educating and engaging with our team members. Working with sustainability networks and green teams is going to be really essential to do that. Looking at office hardware, this is something that we've started to reduce the number of printers that we necessarily need in the office, make sure everything's online. Sustainable technology, refreshing all of our laptops is going to be really essential to actually making sure they're really efficient pieces of pieces of equipment, and they can be donated to schools, which is a really big campaign at the moment. And then tracking the impacts and outcomes. So engaging with team members, as I've mentioned, in the home environment, and making sure that we learn from employee experience about what works for them. And finally, on to our final slide. If we play CSR bingo, I'm pretty sure everyone will be striking off their final point now about there being no silver bullets. Every organization is different. Every organization needs to look at their own specific challenges to get the best outcomes, and that takes a lot of careful planning. And actually, the best of both worlds scenario, is that real? Are we going to be able to manage to create these reductions with people working from home and operating an office? That's going to take a lot of structural change, I think, and to ensure that our emissions aren't going unreported. And that's the biggest challenge we face at the moment. So looking at some short-term easy wins, trying to engage our team members with behavioural changes, doing things differently in their home environment, providing training on what that looks like, encouraging people to install smart meters and changing energy suppliers. Quite a simple change potentially, but getting people to do that is obviously very much up to them, and implementing really rigorous data collection. And then looking at longer term changes, I think Sarah made some really valuable points there too. How is home insulation going to come into this? Actually, people need to start considering potentially, if they're working from home, what the benefits are to that. How can employers help with that? Upgrading devices, installing energy efficient heating and cooling systems, and then making sure that we offset potentially home working emissions as well as office emissions. So, bit of a quick run through at the end there, and sorry if I went over by a few minutes, but hopefully there's some things that help with our consideration moving forward.
Great, thank you very much, James. I know it's a huge topic. It's very difficult to squeeze it all into a few minutes. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Gary Fuller, who's from the MRC Centre for Environment and Health at Imperial College London. Gary asked you to present some data about the impact of homework on air quality. Can you give us an indication on what's been happening in the past year?
Hi, Ben. Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me along. Other speakers have talked about the way that the last 9 months have affected them and their organisations. What I wanted to talk about was very much how the decisions that you've made and the things that you've done have affected everyone else's air pollution. If you could nip to the first slide, please. So what do we do at Imperial? We run London's air pollution measurement network. Our unit, which used to be at King's, and you may know us from there, was founded 27 years ago. And people often come and visit us and want to see our laboratories and our facilities. And we don't really have very many. But what we have out there is London. And we regard London as more or less as an open air laboratory. So it's one in which we measure air pollution, examine the sources, and we look at, for instance, its way in which it's affecting children's health. We also work very closely with the London Mayor to plan things like the ultra low emission zone, the emission, and all of these other policies. And we're working very closely with the City of London and all of the boroughs as well. So visit the London Air webpage and you can find out a lot more about that. But that wasn't really the focus of what I wanted to say today. If I could go to my next slide, please. When lockdown started, if we can cast our minds back all of that time, it brought about a real profound change. You could go and sit out in the garden and it was peaceful from traffic and things like that. And it led to a large number of articles in the media, which, you know, pointed at huge changes in air pollution. But when we look at it in a bit more detail, it's not really that simple. When I talk to people generally about air pollution, you only have to talk for a minute or so before people start pointing a wagging finger at the nearest busy road, or most particularly at the nearest load of diesel traffic. And you would think that simply reducing traffic in the way that we did, certainly in the first lockdown and in other parts of this 9 months, would lead to a profound change in air pollution. But air pollution is not that simple, and it doesn't just come from traffic. So what we have seen is a very large decrease in traffic pollutants. So during lockdown number 1, NO2 in London itself, even away from roads, reduced by about 20%. So that's nitrogen dioxide. This is mainly coming from diesel traffic. Some places in central London, we were seeing around 55% reduction. But in a bizarre way, ozone, which is another pollutant that affects us at ground level, has a complex chemical relationship with nitrogen dioxide. So as we cut nitrogen dioxide, it meant that ozone went up. Also, the start of lockdown, if you remember, that's March time, and March is springtime, and spring is the time that farmers begin spreading manure on the land and fertilizing their crops. This mixes with a lot of the air pollution that we have from traffic and industry in our homes anyway, and leads to very large particle episodes. Spring is often the worst polluted time of year in London because of this interaction with farming and our other pollutants. farming didn't stop through lockdown, and thus we had some really difficult pollution episodes in the early parts of lockdown. Though I think you could probably say they were less severe than they would have been in normal years. If I could take my next slide, please. My colleague Louise prepared this a little while ago, and it shows the progression of traffic air pollution through lockdown. So if I take you to the bottom figure first, it shows hours of day along the x-axis and the concentration of nitrogen dioxide on the y-axis. And the pre-lockdown period, and the bottom panel is a road in central London. Excuse me. The pre-lockdown period is shown in green. You can see the daily variation in the average nitrogen dioxide as people get out of the roads, drive around a lot, and you can see evidence of two sort of rush hour peaks, but they're not actually that distinct. In the first lockdown period, Texas really just did a great deal to remove traffic from central London, and that took us down to the red line. So concentrations here pretty much halved. But gradually, as we returned towards normal, air pollution began to return to normal. So when shops and hospitality opened, we moved to the orange line. And then when schools opened from about August, we moved to the yellow line. But still in the autumn time in central London, we had a lot less traffic pollution than we would have done normally. Sadly, that's not the case if you move your attention to the top panel in suburban London. So yes, in the first lockdown, you can see the difference between the red and the green lines. Yes, air pollution improved. You know, this is the peace on our streets. But gradually, with everyone working from home, people have begun to return to a much more normal pattern of travel in suburban areas, normal deliveries, taking kids to school and so forth. So the air pollution gains have really been mostly confined to the central area. And I think another dimension is in suburban London. Well, we're all really shunning public transport a great deal at the moment, and we're looking to travel around in other ways. Next slide, please. So about our homes, there's been some talk earlier about emissions from homes. And yes, your gas boiler that's heating your home probably at the moment will be adding nitrogen dioxide to the area around you. But we don't think that's necessarily a huge source. One of the largest problematic sources is to do with wood burning. And if you watch an episode of Grand Designs, I thank Kevin McLeod for a lot of this, what you'll see is that at the end of every episode, the people generally have two things that they didn't have at the start. The first one is a baby, and the second one is a nice shiny wood burner in their new lounge, in their place that they've created. And what we've been looking at is wood burning during lockdown. Now, surprisingly, though you might think most air pollution comes from traffic, if we look at particle pollution, the largest single source of particle pollution in the UK is domestic burning of solid fuel, and almost all of that is wood. So some preliminary analysis here. What we did was we looked at the baseline case, which was the wood burning that we've seen in London. So once again, these are diurnal plots with time on the x-axis and the concentration of particles from wood burning on the y-axis. You can see in the grey area we had the time before lockdown, and if I turn your attention to just the darkest red, you can see the wood burning that we experienced during the lockdown period in March and April. And there is some suggestion from this that there was an increase in people burning wood in some locations. You can see in Honor Oak Park out there in suburban London. And interestingly, well, of course, people were burning wood a little bit later on in the evening. It was getting darker later, and perhaps it was slightly milder. Therefore, people were only settling down in front of their fire later on in the evening. We have a project with DEFRA to try to look at this in a lot more detail. Next, please. And it's not just the things we do that affect our outdoor air, it's also the things that we do inside. I apologize for the complexity of this one on a small screen, but what we have here is we've been modeling people's air pollution exposure and taking into account that people actually move. So we have people, we take typical journeys that people do and we move them through a modelled air pollution domain. And we have different types of workers here. So we have children, we have people that take the tube, we have drivers and so forth. So what we did was we modelled some different changes about what would have happened to people's air pollution exposures during lockdown. And our assumption here was that the hospital workers that you can see and the professional drivers continue to work as usual. Tube users, we assumed they all stayed at home and didn't commute, and children also stayed at home. So the top panels show some improvement in the air pollution exposure that's happened for professional drivers and for hospital workers that we're assuming are still travelling into the centre of London because concentrations have improved there. But what we also did was we took into account in-house air pollution. And if you remember in the early days of lockdown, when we were all embracing it enthusiastically, everyone was out buying flour and baking bread and cooking and making cakes. So what we added in was an extra hour's worth of cooking into the home environment. And you can see that that extra hour's worth of cooking in terms of nitrogen dioxide actually offset the gains in pollution exposure that had been achieved by all of the other external lockdown changes. I won't go into the detail of the bottom set, but the story is near enough the same. But it's just a lot smaller than my screen than I expected. So if we move to the next slide. Knowing I'm expecting here that many people have an interest in architecture here. So this is an advert really for something that's beyond what I'm talking about here, which is the Clean Air Programme. And some of you may know that around £42 million is being invested by UK research, by Met Office for the Public Sector, Innovate UK and government departments in air pollution over the next handful of years through a number of projects. The Wave 1 ones have looked at analysis and solutions, but perhaps relevant to the discussion here, the Wave 2 ones are looking at the indoor-outdoor interface. And given the architectural interest of the people on the call, it's just a bit of an advert to go and look this up and to see whether you can interact with any of the networks and projects that are being created there. Okay, so if we could just briefly move to my last couple of slides. I really think it's important with air pollution. We often look at it in some doom-laden scenario that it's all pessimistic. And I think what we need to do is to reach out to those people that are redesigning our city and be responsible for our city to create new environments that are pollution free or low pollution. I mean, if you look at these environments here, they all exist. And to be honest, I would prefer to live in them rather than the car-filled streets that are outside my house at the moment. Next slide. And just building on this whole idea of trying to envisage what would a smog-free city look like. If you would like to do a bit of follow-up, I did a project with the Guardian that I also write for. And there's this article with the link is at the bottom there about a smog-free city. So thinking about ideas like turning our roads, as in this main panel, into other types of environment, like into parks or into green walkways and green transport, moving the transport argument beyond diesel, petrol, electric into active travel, and also ensuring that the rest of the environment around our cities make sure that we have healthy cities on the inside. And I have no shame, there's a plug for my book there as well, if anyone is interested. And I think if you just move on to the next slide, I think that's the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gary. Okay, so our final speaker today is Kate Finnis, who is Membership Manager at Heart of the City. Kate, can you tell us some practical steps to reduce emissions from home working?
Hi, Ben. Hi, everyone. Yes, absolutely. So as part of our foundation programme, Heart of the City supports London-based small and medium-sized businesses to develop and expand their responsible business initiatives. So in the very recent past, we've been looking at this huge topic and thinking about how we can support our members to digest all of this information and the expectation on businesses, and how they can make it relevant to their business, their people and their teams. During the pandemic, we've worked closely with our members to to support them in influencing and encouraging their people to think about working sustainably from home. And really, it's going back to starting with the basics. So the most impactful way a company can make a positive impact towards sustainability efforts while everyone is remote is really taking their teams and their people on the journey with them. So I'm just going to share what's worked for some of our members in the recent past. Next slide, please. So in terms of engaging your people, our members have found it really relevant and helpful to develop a policy for energy efficiency. So this has been mentioned a couple of times already. With our employees working from home and winter energy bills increasing, businesses are seeing a direct impact on their business carbon footprint, and to reduce this, you can help your employees to think about their energy bills by switching to a renewable energy provider. And as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, you might consider looking into green energy rates for your teams. There are a few green energy suppliers who are working to facilitate this for businesses at the moment. And in terms of communicating your longer term goals, when you're thinking about how you talk about reducing your carbon footprint and achieving net zero, it's really important to showcase to your employees how they are contributing to that. And to reiterate what's already been said, when we're reviewing these goals, we need to think about considering the greater longer term levels of working from home and how that will impact your carbon calculations. And again, what a blended office and home working future could look like. Going back again, I think we've all said when we cast our minds back a year, we probably provided our people and our teams some equipment to work from home, and we initially thought that was going to be in the short term. So it's probably worth having a review of the equipment your people are using and considering if these are still fit for purpose. Could we look at more energy efficient equipment to help our teams work more effectively? And there's some simple things we can do in terms of asking our people to update their settings to energy saving modes for laptops, computers and printers, potentially providing ergonomical desks and chairs to support people's health from working at home as well is another consideration. And in general, maintaining a culture of sustainability. So engaging people through virtual workshops and opportunities and events, and sharing your ideas and initiatives to get your people thinking about working sustainably. And our members have worked through a variety of initiatives to involve their people. We've had members pull together step competitions to encourage their people to use transport less often, running meat-free Master Chef style lunch online sessions, and even hosting ugly jumper days, so encouraging people to layer up and turn down their heating. So all of these are really nice ways to engage your people and keep things social as well. I think everybody is over the Zoom meetings and Zoom quizzes, so it's really important to think about how else we can engage our teams. And finally, making sure you're telling powerful stories about what your business is doing. It's really engaging for your employees to feel that they are contributing to the bigger picture. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And we've talked about previously bringing individuals in your individual people's awareness around to their personal sustainability and engaging people in different ways, because not everybody is going to be bought into their own sustainable efforts, I suppose, in the home place from the get-go. So it's important to talk about how they can save and reduce while they are working from home. So a lot of our members have talked to their people about potential opportunities to decrease their personal carbon emissions and also save money. So if somebody isn't naturally bought into having a hugely sustainable lifestyle, hopefully the cost saving will get them on board. So there are some really, I suppose, simple things that we can encourage people to do, because while we've been working at home, potentially we've been slipping into some bad habits that can easily be reversed. So some really basic things, making sure you're encouraging people and reminding people to turn their equipment off fully rather than leaving them on standby, switching to LED light bulbs. I've mentioned walking and cycling rather than taking cars if they have to make any journeys. And even just turning your thermostat down by 1 degree can save around £90 a year. So that cost saving hopefully will encourage people to make that small change. Next slide, please. And then there are several things that we can talk to our teams about doing in the home place. We've already mentioned draft proofing, loft insulation, installing new boilers can save about £220 a year, and really simple things like washing clothes in cold water and then air drying them rather than using tumble dryers is all going to have an impact on your individual's carbon emissions. And then we've probably heard this quite a few times, eating less meat is probably the most straightforward way to reduce your carbon emissions. And we've had some members run social events around that, like I've mentioned, kind of a MasterChef style meat-free lunch event. Previously, it was mentioned around reducing and recycling from the home. Most of our office spaces have effective recycling in place, but we can't assume that our people are continuing with this in the home. So it's just to encourage conversations around that and to circle back with your people to kind of bring these ideas again to the forefront of their mind. So if you move on to the next slide, just quickly, I suppose that for some businesses that are just starting out thinking about how they can encourage their people to do this, there are a lot of tools and resources on the Heart of the City Resource Hub on our website. Everything there is open access, and anyone's more than welcome to take those resources and support their sustainability efforts with those. We've had quite a few members ask their individual teams to measure their carbon footprint, and there are a few different tools and resources out there to do that for free. It takes about 5 minutes. And then we've also had some of the companies we're working with look into offsetting their team's carbon emissions if they aren't encouraging people to do that personally, but there's a lot of simple ways to do that as an individual now too. Just encouraging mindful travel of your teams when they are out and about. And I think ultimately, for small businesses particularly, when you're starting out in this journey, it's very overwhelming. So make sure you're using what's already out there. Don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel with things. And the last slide, please, is just to encourage you to get in touch with us if you are a London-based business and you need some support to get going in your responsible business journey, specifically around home working and sustainability. Feel free to reach out to us and get in touch. We'd be more than happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Now, the observant among you will realise it's 9:29, but I've decided we're going to run over a little bit. So apologies. If you do have to go, then do head off. But we've got some really interesting questions coming through that I want to put to our panel. So the first one is kind of an open one, and I don't know if anyone knows this, but we've got a question here. The prospects for collective purchasing are really interesting. Are any companies subsidising the cost of employees switching to renewable energy or other sustainable utilities in their homes? I don't know, James, if this is something that you guys looked at.
So at the moment, we haven't actually started looking at that specifically, but it is certainly part of the conversation that the property committee are currently looking at, because we're in the point of discussing exactly how we use our office building as it is at the moment. And so this is going to feed into exactly how we move some of that into the home environment. So we don't actually have any specific answer to that at the moment.
Kate or anyone else, have you heard of this coming up?
And I'm not familiar with companies subsidising, but I know there are some green energy companies that are looking into offering their clients' people preferential rates if they switch. So I think in the next few months we'll probably hear quite a lot more about that. So that would be a solution.
I think Sarah, you seem to nod your head. Yeah.
We're certainly looking at it. I mean, obviously, we need to, because that's exactly what our members would expect we would be doing. But also it's the right thing to do. So yes, that's kind of for next year. I think everybody's reflected that it's been kind of just get through this bit. But to that point I was making about a far more engaged conversation to have with your workforce about green energy. But some people, I'll be honest, we have offered quite a lot of stuff, low energy appliances if you're working from home. Some people say, do you know what, that's too much like intrusion. You're my employer, not my charm. So I think it's not a kind of an unalloyed good where we might think as employers everybody wants to do this. You have to be quite careful with boundaries as well, I think.
Well, there's a very interesting question here. It's posted to you, Sarah, but actually, I think maybe Gary, you might have a thought on this. And this is that, Sarah, you mentioned about having members in over 115 countries. Do you have any insight on the differences in environmental concerns and consequent actions over working from home as a result of different countries or cultures they are in? Do you see a difference?
Yeah, we have a very big group, particularly in Middle East, North Africa and Australia and New Zealand. And of course, you know, when we have conversations, we had a workshop this week, in fact, with colleagues in New Zealand who are out the other side, but still working from home, interestingly. I mean, I think that this is why I'm pretty confident, as we all are, that we've kind of broken the back of this idea that we all pile into an office. It's just not happening, even in places where they have no restrictions anymore. And also this point about the global marketplace, we've got members now who are saying, do you know what, I can work anywhere in the world. And if if you've got the talent, if you've got the skills, people will be after you, and it will be seen as as an unalloyed good. So I think, as employers, we have to kind of sharpen up our act and make sure that we're offering the best for the best, as it were.
Gary, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if I could just slip in with a comment. I mean, we all look at this working from home as a great thing and as an opportunity, perhaps to reduce our travel and perhaps to reduce the environmental impact of that side of the things that we do. But I don't know about your workplace, but we've been working from home for many years, albeit people doing so on a part-time basis. And the consequence of this seems not to be that people are minimizing their travel, but it's just that we're getting employees who live further away. So rather than commuting from suburban London into the centre 4 or 5 days a week, we're having employees that might live in Leeds or might live in the West Country, and they commute to London once or twice a week. So I'm not so convinced that the changes that we're bringing about are always going to be immediately beneficial. And there's lots of evidence that, when we're at home, we don't necessarily decide to travel in sustainable ways as we might do for our main commute. So, yeah, I think this has big effects and different effects well outside London and internationally as well.
Great, thank you, Gary. I'm going to try and take a couple more questions. Could Sarah and others give us an idea how they calculate their winter premium they give employees, and if it's possible, what the figure is? I'll come to you first, Sarah.
Yeah, we did a benchmarking exercise with other organisations and in a similar space, and we added another fiver. I mean, to be honest, there wasn't really a very sophisticated metric around it. We were very aware, and I know I don't want to stamp all over the chairman's privilege, but there's a couple of questions about inequality. We were very, very aware that this is exacerbating some quite deep inequalities already within even ourselves as a workforce, and so we made sure that I think it's about £40 a month. Which of course is taxed for some people, so that's 30 quid a month probably. And then in addition, we're giving the tax-free working from home government, which is 7 quid a week. So altogether, probably about 50 quid a month.
Great, thank you. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that one? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish on quite a general one. Sorry, there are lots of other questions. What we'll try and do is ping these across to our speakers afterwards if they might be happy to answer offline. But there was one here that was a very good one, I think, to finish on. And this was, we've had quite a few things that we can ask employees to do at home to help minimize emissions while working at home. But what are the best ways to bring people along with us? How do we actually get people to do this? Why don't I come to Kate first?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we've said, you're not going to have a solution that engages everybody. So I think it's coming at it from a few different angles, and also depending on the business industry you're in and the nature of the way that your teams work. Some of our members have used good old-fashioned healthy competition and set literally reduction goals from one team to the next, and kind of got people to report back on those. There's some of the things I mentioned before as well in terms of employee engagement and ideas to make things a little bit more lighthearted, because it is such a huge and powerful subject. But yeah, it's really feeling out what works best for your different teams, because there isn't going to be a one fits all.
Yeah, and you mentioned the financial implications as well as things like turning down your heating. James, I'll come to you next.
I think one of the really significant things from my perspective is how we get our various stakeholders across the office environment involved. It's all very well working in CSR as I do and having good intentions a lot of the time, but actually if your senior leadership team aren't necessarily coming on that journey with you and modeling that behavior, communicating that on a regular basis, and actually celebrating the successes we do have, it can be very difficult to then suggest that other people within the organization should be taking the sort of brunt of that. So I just think that I've been really lucky that we've had really positive engagement with our senior leadership team, and they really want to start making this a reality in the way that we work and moving forward. So I just think that's really, really significant and not always the case with every single organization.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Sorry, it dropped out a little bit there. My apologies.
So yeah, we were just asking a question about how do we bring people along with us? What's the best way to get our employees to get on board with this?
Well, I mean, I suppose we're in a very good position because a lot of the people join IEMA as a member of the staff team because they want to save the planet and support low carbon. And in fact, you know, we're very lucky. We have some really talented people who've joined from, you know, big London advertising agencies, you know, because they want to do the right thing. And Kate's point about reducing meat in the diet, we have a very high proportion of vegans and vegetarians who work with us for that reason. So we've got that motivation there already. So in a way, which is great because they're kind of pushing us the whole time. I have suggested to our board, I don't know if we've got any board members on the call, but that we should have, whenever we do meet again, that we should meet in a vegan restaurant for dinner beforehand. And that's been, I think that there may be a little bit more cultural work to do there, but you know, that's the sort of thing. As Kate says,
if any of your board members are on the call, you know, we all approve. So I think, yeah, go ahead and do
Mildred. My vote is for Mildred.
And Gary, any thoughts on how to sort of motivate people to get on board with this?
Well, from the perspective of my own team, I can only really agree with Sarah's comment. You know, the majority of the people that I'm responsible for managing are keen environmentalists themselves. I think one of the things to do is to perhaps help people think about the things that they are doing at home, since working from home radically changes everything in our habits. You know, our daily lives are really run to the drumbeat of doing things like taking the kids to school, getting ourselves to work and things like that. And we know from things like nudge theory that if you want to go in and make a change in people's lives, then you try to put suggestions in at a time when other things are changing. So this is an ideal time to get people to think not just about their business life, but encourage them to think about the way in which they're spending their home lives. For instance, driving less, can you shop locally and things like that? And having those conversations with our workforces in order to bring about some, you know, good behaviour. We've also been doing some work previous to this with the City Air campaign that's run by Corporation of London, and they've also tried to tackle some of these cultural things. For instance, you know, businesses in the city tackling the culture and really challenging people, saying, well, why are you taking a taxi to go from one meeting to the next when nothing's really more than a kilometre and a bit away? Why not walk? Why not enjoy the sunshine? And trying to do the same thing to suggestions for people now that we're all working from home, I think would be a very good way forward. So trying to nudge people's behaviour really rather than telling them to do things. And to be honest, when it comes to telling people to do things and trying to exert too many changes, you know, I've got staff that are working in shared homes, staff that are struggling each day with their kids in the background, and I'm not going to apply pressure on them to change their diets to be vegetarian or whatever. But I think we should be trying to help them think about the things that they are doing now that they're at home.
Definitely. Thank you, Gary. So we are just about 10 minutes over. So apologies, we did run over, but as you can tell, it's a huge topic. Quite a few questions we didn't get to, so apologies for that. We have heard a lot of things that everybody at home can do and can encourage their employees to do as well. We will share the presentations after. There were some great insights from everybody here, and Kate's got some good simple tips there. I would also encourage you to look at the event page for this event. In the very last line, there's a link to the work that we did with Nomura, Cheapside Business Alliance, City Air, and NLA together on these sort of very simple 10 top tips. Some of them we've heard that are very simple ways to get started. So thank you all for joining. I did just also want to flag up next week, we've got the London Real Estate Forum, all free to join. We've got Sadiq Khan speaking, Andy Burnham, lots of really interesting talks there. So do look on the website for that. Thank you all to our speakers for coming and for everyone at home for joining us. And we'll see you again at events soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.